Sarah Calloway, a capable but underestimated she-wolf with distant human ancestry, spends 6 years loyally serving the Ironvale Pack and supporting her mate Darian Voss, only to be publicly humiliated when he severs their bond before the entire pack so he can pursue a politically advantageous marriage with the pure-blooded Lady Neva of House Avara, claiming Sarah's bloodline is unworthy of his future. Heartbroken, but determined to reclaim her own agency, Sarah leaves the pack in a storm and impulsively proposes marriage to a mysterious stranger who immediately accepts and reveals himself to be Kael Grayson, the feared Lycan King. Taken to his ancient palace, Draesonvale, Sarah begins experiencing strange events as forgotten magical wards awaken in her presence and sealed doors react to her touch, while Kael and his household behave as though they have long expected her arrival. Investigating the royal archives, Sarah uncovers evidence that a female infant was secretly placed within Ironvale under a sealed covenant 23 years earlier, protected by a curse that concealed her true identity until she willingly formed and then lost a genuine mate bond. During a royal bloodline census, Sarah's blood unexpectedly burns with intertwined gold and silver flames, revealing an extinct royal lineage and confirming she is actually Serafine Draeson, the long-lost Lycan princess hidden as a child to protect the royal family from political enemies. Kael finally reveals that Sarah is his younger sister, secretly sent away as a baby under a magical curse while he spent decades searching for her, and that her public rejection by Darian unknowingly fulfilled the final condition needed to break the curse. Realizing powerful packs manipulated her entire life for political gain, Sarah confronts Kael, Darian, Neva, and the Lycan Court with evidence exposing the conspiracy, forcing Darian's Alpha Prime bid to be suspended and reopening decades-old political agreements built on deception. When Darian publicly challenges her legitimacy before the assembled summit, Sarah instinctively transforms into her true royal Lycan form, proving her identity beyond dispute as the court kneels before the returned princess. Rather than seeking revenge, Sarah chooses justice by pursuing legal accountability for those responsible while refusing unnecessary cruelty. She reclaims her royal heritage, restores her family's legacy, and discovers her birth name means she who returns, honoring her mother's hope that she would one day come home. Meanwhile, Kael and Sarah petition the neutral court to resolve the accidental marriage bond they entered before learning they were siblings, creating an unprecedented legal case. In the end, Sarah remains in Draesonvale not because of blood politics or obligation, but because she finally chooses her own future, embracing her true identity as the lost princess who has finally returned home. They say the fates are cruel, but I think they have a sense of humor, because the night Darian Voss looked me in the eyes that had seen me bleed for his pack train for his wars, love him in silence for 6 years and said, "You are not enough for my bloodline." I didn't cry. I walked. Straight out of the Ironvale Pack's gates, straight into a storm, straight into a man I had never seen before. Tall as a cathedral, eyes like molten silver, a scar running down his jaw like a crack in marble. He looked at me the way no one ever had. Not with pity, not with dismissal, with recognition. And before I could speak, before I could think, I said 7 words I cannot take back. Marry me. Right now. Tonight, no questions, he said yes. What I didn't know, what no one told me, was that the stranger in the rain wasn't just a man. He was Kael Grayson, the Lycan King, the one creature every alpha on this continent feared, and I had just become his queen. But here's the part that will haunt you. He already knew my name. Chapter 1. They had a saying in the Ironvale Pack, bloodline is the bone, everything else is flesh. It was carved above the Great Hall's entrance in old Lycan script, faded now worn smooth by decades of hands that never questioned it. Children learned it before they learned to shift. Elders quoted it at naming ceremonies, at council hearings, at funerals. It was not merely a saying, it was architecture. The invisible structure upon which every rank, every marriage, every decision in Ironvale was built. Sarah Voss had spent 6 years learning to live inside that structure without being crushed by it. She knew exactly what she was in the eyes of this pack. She was not blind to it, not naive, not the kind of woman who needed flattery to feel anchored. She was human-blooded, a she-wolf, yes, but one whose lineage carried the quiet stain of mortality somewhere 3 generations back. Enough wolf to shift to fight to feel the moon like a pull behind her sternum. Not enough in Ironvale's estimation to matter. And yet she was here. 6 years in, still standing, she had earned that even if they would never say so. The training yard at dawn was hers before anyone else arrived. That was intentional. Everything Sarah did was intentional. She moved through her drills in the gray pre-morning light, her breath misting in the cold, her footwork precise and economical. She had trained Ironvale's border warriors in close combat techniques that none of the pureblood instructors bothered to learn older forms, human military forms adapted for wolf speed and wolf instinct. Things she had studied obsessively in the years before her bond with Darian was formalized when she was still Sarah Calloway, and her only currency was capability. The warriors respected her for it. They would run drills she designed, follow formations she mapped, trust the strategies she whispered to Darian before council meeting strategies he would then present as his own. And she would stand 2 steps behind him and say nothing. She said nothing about a great many things. She knew where Eldercroft hid the falsified border reports. She knew which council member had been skimming tribute from the Eastern Territories. She knew that the Ironvale Pack's legendary victory at the Greymoor border 3 years ago was not the Alpha's tactical genius. It was a plan she had drawn at a kitchen table at 2 o'clock in the morning while Darian slept. She kept these things the way one keeps old letters carefully privately, not yet ready to burn them. Darian Voss was beautiful the way a blade was beautiful, purposeful, cold-edged, designed to impress before it was designed to cut. He had his father's jaw and his mother's political instincts, and he wore charisma the way other men wore armor naturally without effort. Because it had been fitted to him so young, he no longer noticed its weight. Sarah had loved him genuinely and without performance. She had loved him through the early years when he was still becoming, when his ambition hadn't yet hardened into ruthlessness, when he would find her in the training yard before dawn and watch her work with something in his eyes that looked like wonder. She had loved him through the border wars, through the council disputes, through the quiet erosion of 1,000 small moments where she chose him over herself. She was not certain if pressed when that love had begun to shift into something more like habit. Perhaps it didn't matter. What mattered was this: she was loyal, ferociously, immovably loyal, not because she was required to be, because loyalty was the one currency Ironvale could not manufacture with bloodline, and she had built her entire place in this pack on the foundation of it. That had seemed once like enough. She was leaving the training yard when she heard it. 2 of the Elder Council members stood beneath the covered corridor that ran between the Great Hall and the strategy wing, speaking in the lowered voices of men who believed distance made them private. Sarah moved without thinking, years of instinct of learning to be unnoticed, and stood motionless in the shadow of a stone pillar close enough to hear. The House of Avara has formally responded. And favorably, Lady Neva will attend the autumn summit. Her father has indicated he's open to discussing the alliance. A pause, the sound of something being set down, a cup perhaps, or a document. Darian will be pleased. Darian was the one who initiated contact. The older voice carried something careful in it. Not disapproval, something more like the professional neutrality of a man who had learned not to have opinions about things he couldn't change. The Avara bloodline goes back to the first packs. A union there would give him the purity claim he needs to challenge for Alpha Prime. And his current bond, the silence that followed, lasted exactly long enough to answer the question. These things are managed, the older voice said finally. It won't be the first time a bond has been restructured for the good of the pack. Their footsteps moved away, the corridor emptied. Sarah stood in the shadow of the pillar for a long moment, her hand flat against the cold stone. Restructured. She turned the word over slowly, the way you might turn over a stone to see what lived beneath it. She was not shaking. She noticed that, noted it, the way she noted everything with the precise, unflinching attention she had trained into herself over years of being in rooms where her survival depended on seeing clearly. She was not shaking. Her wolf, however, was very, very still. That stillness was not peace. She knew the difference. It was the particular stillness of an animal that has heard something it does not yet understand and is waiting with absolute patience to understand it fully before it decides what to do. Sarah pushed off from the pillar. She walked back toward the eastern quarters with her spine straight and her face composed and her mind already moving, sorting, filing, preparing the way it always moved when she sensed the ground beginning to shift beneath her. She had survived this pack for 6 years. She intended to survive what was coming. She just didn't know yet that survival and escape were not always the same thing. Chapter 2. They called it a severance rite. In the old texts, it was meant to be a private thing, a quiet dissolution between 2 wolves whose bond had simply failed to hold, witnessed by one elder and recorded without ceremony, a merciful ending, a closed door. Darian did not do it privately. He sent the summons at midday when the Great Hall would be fullest, when the pack would be gathered for the afternoon meal, when the elders would be in their seats and the warriors would be at the long tables and the visiting delegation from the House of Avara would be positioned as they had been all week in the elevated guest section draped in silver cloth and quiet judgment. Sarah received the summons on a folded piece of formal parchment sealed with Darian's crest. She read it once, set it down, looked at the wall for a moment that might have been 5 seconds or 5 minutes. Then she dressed carefully and went. She heard the hall before she entered it. Not noise silence, the specific weighted silence of a large room full of people who have already been told what they are about to witness. Someone had warned them, someone had prepared the audience before the subject had even arrived. And that detail told Sarah everything she needed to know about what this was. This was not a severance rite, this was a performance. She pushed the doors open herself without waiting to be announced and walked into the great hall of the Ironvale Pack with her shoulders back and her chin level and her face arranged into an expression she had spent years perfecting, composed, attentive, and entirely unreadable. The room was exactly as she had imagined it. Elders in their carved seats along the left wall, warriors at the long tables, some with the decency to look at their hands. And at the high seat, the chair reserved for honored guests, Lady Neva of Avara, draped in silver gray silk, her pureblood composure immaculate. Her dark eyes tracking Sarah's entrance with an expression Sarah couldn't immediately name. Darian stood at the center of the hall. He looked, as he always looked, extraordinary. Tall, composed, dressed in the formal black of Ironvale authority, his alpha mark visible at his throat. He watched her walk toward him with an expression she recognized, the one he wore in council when he had already decided the outcome and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. She stopped 3 feet from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he began. He spoke the opening words of the severance right in the old tongue, and the formal cadence of it landed on the room like a stone dropped in still water, ripples of discomfort spreading outward in silence. Sarah watched his mouth form the ancient syllables and felt something cold and clarifying move through her chest. She had translated those texts for him once 2 years ago. He had asked her to for a council record he was compiling. He was using her own work to unmake her. The irony was almost elegant. The old tongue rite was short, brutal in its efficiency. A declaration of severance, a formal renunciation of shared name. A stripping of rank and place spoken aloud so that the pack bond could hear it and release. But Darian did not stop at the formal words. That would not have served the theater. He spoke beyond them in common tongue, now turning slightly so the room could hear him fully. Sarah Calloway came to this pack with dedication, he said. His voice was warm, measured, the voice of a man performing reluctant mercy. She served Ironvale faithfully, and that service is honored. But a bond must be built on matched foundation. It must carry the weight of legacy of lineage, the weight of what we are building for the generations that follow us. He paused. To keep her bound to a destiny she was not made for would be a cruelty I am not willing to commit. This is not a dismissal, this is a release. The word hung in the air like smoke. Release. As though she were a bird he had been keeping in too small a cage. As though the last 6 years had been his patience rather than her labor. As though she should be grateful, and the room Sarah could feel it was deciding whether to believe him. She looked at him. She had told herself, in the walk from the eastern quarters to this hall, that she would not speak, she would not beg. That had never been a possibility, but she had considered briefly whether she would say anything at all. She decided against it. Words would have given him something to respond to, something to reframe, to use, to perform against. Silence was the one thing he could not control. So she looked at him directly, steadily, without heat and without collapse, and she waited. Something moved behind his eyes. A flicker of something she might once have called shame, though she wasn't certain he was still capable of it. His jaw shifted slightly. And then in a room full of warriors and elders and a pureblood lady watching from a silver-draped chair, Darian Voss looked away first. It lasted only a second, but it was a second the entire room witnessed, and the silence that followed had a different texture than the one before it. At the high seat, Lady Neva's expression changed barely. Just a fractional adjustment around the eyes that could have meant anything, and that Sarah filed away automatically out of habit, out of the discipline of 6 years reading rooms she wasn't meant to read. The gates of Ironvale were iron and oak, fitted to close against siege or storm. They were open now. Sarah walked through them and didn't look back, and the storm that had been gathering since morning broke the moment her feet crossed the boundary line, rain immediate and total, the kind that doesn't build but arrives cold and indifferent and absolute. She walked into it. The pack bond dissolved somewhere in her chest. She felt it a quiet severing like a thread pulled loose from fabric. 6 years of belonging gone in a sensation smaller than she had expected. She was somewhere between the gate and the tree line, rain-soaked and stripped of her name when her wolf moved. Not in distress, not in grief, her wolf, who had been barely a whisper for months, muffled and distant in a way Sarah had quietly worried about but never spoken aloud, rose in her chest like something waking from a long, unnatural sleep and growled. Not in pain, in recognition. Sarah stopped walking, stood in the rain, pressed one hand to her sternum and felt it that rumble, low and steady and utterly unfamiliar because her wolf had never sounded like that before. As though something somewhere had finally been unlocked. She didn't understand it, not yet. She kept walking. Chapter 3. She walked for 40 minutes before she stopped pretending she had a destination. The storm had no interest in her situation. It came down in sheets, indifferent and relentless, turning the dirt road to mud and the tree line to shadow. Sarah's boots were soaked through. Her formal clothes she had dressed carefully this morning, she remembered some stubborn instinct toward dignity, were plastered to her skin. Her hair was a ruin. She stood at the edge of the Ironvale boundary road and took inventory the way she always took inventory, coldly, honestly, without the luxury of denial. She had no pack, no rank, no name that meant anything to anyone within 20 miles. She had the clothes on her body, the small amount of currency folded into the inner pocket of her jacket, enough for perhaps 2 nights in a roadside lodge if she found one, and 6 years of knowledge that belonged to a life she had just been publicly removed from. She also had a wolf that was growling steadily in her chest like a fire that had been waiting for air. Useful inventory, grim inventory. She started walking again. She found him at the edge of the old crossing. The archway had been a gatehouse once decades ago before the boundary road was rerouted. What remained was 2 pillars of rain-darkened stone and a collapsed lintel between them, enough overhang to shelter perhaps one person from the worst of the rain if they stood close to the left pillar and didn't mind the cold. He was standing exactly there. Sarah almost walked past him. She registered him as peripheral, a shape, a shadow, another thing in the landscape of a very bad evening. But her wolf reacted before her eyes fully processed him. A sudden, sharp attention that snapped through her chest like a struck bell. She stopped. He was tall in a way that recalibrated the surrounding space. Not the cultivated height of a man who had learned to use his size as social leverage, something different, something structural. As though he had been built around a different set of requirements than ordinary men. He wore dark, plain clothing with no pack markings anywhere she could identify. And he stood with his arms loose at his sides and his weight evenly balanced in the stance of someone who had spent so long being the most dangerous thing in every room that they had stopped needing to signal it. His face was angular, severe, bisected by a scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his jaw like a fault line. His eyes, when they found her, and they found her immediately with no search, as if he had known exactly where to look, where the color of stormlight silver shot through with gray. He looked at her, she looked at him. Her wolf went absolutely silent, not the muffled silence of before the silence of something paying total consuming attention. Later, Sarah would try to explain what happened next and find that she couldn't quite, not in a way that satisfied logic. She could describe the components, the rage still moving through her like a current with nowhere to go, the cold clarity that had replaced shock, the feeling of standing at the exact edge of one life with nothing yet begun of the next. She could describe the calculus, the strange arithmetic of a woman who has just had her agency surgically removed, deciding to exercise it in the most immediate way available. But she could never fully explain why it was that, specifically only that it felt less like impulse and more like the only sentence that fit the moment. She walked to the archway and stopped 2 feet from him and said, "Marry me." The rain filled the silence. "Tonight," she added, "right now, before I walk another step down that road." He had not moved, had not stepped back, had not reached for anything, had not done the normal human things people did when a soaked stranger proposed marriage under a collapsed gatehouse in a storm. He simply watched her with those stormlight eyes in a stillness so complete it was almost its own kind of answer. "I'm not asking because I need saving," she said, and her voice was steady, which she was distantly proud of. "I'm not asking because I'm frightened. I'm asking because the last man who thought I wasn't worth choosing just announced it to an audience, and I would like very much to make a choice of my own before this night is over." She held his gaze. Let him see all of it, the fury, the precision, the absolute absence of performance. Something shifted in his face so subtle she almost missed it. Not amusement, not condescension, not pity, not the careful diplomacy of a man deciding how to extract himself from an awkward situation. It looked unsettlingly like relief, as though something long anticipated had finally arrived. "Yes," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried a resonance that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. One syllable. No conditions, no questions. Sarah blinked. You don't know my name. No. You don't know anything about me. No, he said again, and then quietly, do you want to wait until I do? She thought about Darian's voice. Release. She thought about the hall full of witnesses and the silver-draped woman in the high seat and 6 years of choosing someone else's future over her own. No, she said. He knew the words. That was the first thing that should have given her pause, that when she said, then say it. Say something binding. He didn't hesitate, didn't search his memory. He simply spoke. And what came out of him was old tongue older than the phrases she had translated for council records, older than the Ironvale rites. A cadence that moved through the rain-cold air like it had weight, like it displaced something. She repeated what he spoke phrase by phrase, her pronunciation rougher, but her intention absolute. When it was done, the storm didn't stop. Nothing magical happened, no light, no warmth, nothing cinematic. It was just two people standing in the rain having said words to each other. He reached into his jacket and pressed something into her palm. Cool metal, small. She closed her fingers around it without looking. Come, he said simply. There's shelter an hour from here. She followed him. Not because she trusted him, she didn't know him. Because her wolf, for the first time in longer than she could remember, was calm. That night, she slept in a dry room in a roadside wayhouse and did not dream. In the gray light of morning, she opened her hand and looked at what he had given her. A ring, heavy, dark metal, simply made. She turned it over. On the inner face, almost too small to see a crown. Chapter 4, she saw Draesonvale before she understood what she was seeing. They crested a long ridge as the morning fog was still burning off, and it was simply there, filling the valley below like something that had grown rather than been built. Stone towers the color of charcoal and bone rising in uneven heights against a sky that couldn't decide between gray and blue. Walls that had been added to across centuries, each generation's architecture visible in the layering like rings inside a tree. It was not beautiful the way designed things were beautiful. It was beautiful the way old mountains were beautiful through sheer indifferent permanence. Sarah stopped walking without meaning to. Beside her, Kael said nothing. He had said very little since the wayhouse. She was discovering a man who treated silence as a complete sentence. She studied the palace for a long moment, waiting for the feeling that came when you looked at something truly foreign. That slight cognitive resistance, the mental adjustment of this is new, this is unknown. It didn't come. Instead, looking down at Draesonvale, she felt something she could not name and did not trust. A kind of pressure behind her sternum. Not recognition exactly, something quieter than recognition, more like almost. She kept walking. The gates of Draesonvale were open, not in the casual way of a place expecting routine visitors, open in the specific, deliberate way of a place expecting someone. The household guards on either side of the entrance stood at formal attention, which Sarah noted with the part of her mind that filed things away automatically. She was a stranger to them. There was no reason for formal attention. She walked through the gates beside a man she had known for less than 12 hours, wearing his ring in her jacket pocket, and tried to look like she knew where she was going. The head of household staff met them in the main courtyard, a tall woman in her 60s, silver-haired, with the upright posture of someone who had managed powerful people for decades and had long since stopped being impressed by them. She greeted Kael with a short practiced nod and then turned to Sarah, and something happened to her face. Not surprise. That was the thing Sarah noticed immediately, the thing that settled wrong like a picture hung at a slight angle. The woman's expression didn't shift into surprise. It shifted into something that looked much more like the quiet exhale of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific piece of news and has finally received it. Welcome to Draesonvale, she said. Her voice was even composed appropriate. Then she turned to direct the junior staff, and as she passed Sarah close enough that it could not have been accidental, she said it barely above breath, "The lost daughter returns." Sarah's head turned sharply, but the woman was already moving, issuing instructions to the household staff with brisk efficiency, her face revealing nothing. The words apparently already swallowed back into professionalism. Sarah looked at Kael. He was watching her with those unreadable stormlight eyes, and she had the distinct impression that he had heard every syllable and had chosen with great deliberateness to say absolutely nothing about it. The east corridor was where it first happened. A staff member was showing Sarah to her quarters through the main hall, up a wide staircase down a corridor that ran the length of the eastern wing. The corridor was lined with iron sconces fitted with wards for light, the old kind Sarah knew activated by bloodline resonance and recharged by proximity of a recognized family member. They had not been lit in years. She could see the dust on the iron fittings. She was 3 steps past the first sconce when it came on. Not flickered, not dimly caught, on full warm, immediate, as though it had simply been waiting for the correct presence to pass beneath it. The sconce behind her followed, then the next, like a chain of small recognitions, each one lighting as she walked beneath it, illuminating the corridor in her wake all the way back to the staircase. The staff member guiding her had stopped walking. Sarah stopped too and turned to look at the corridor, every sconce lit. The dust on the iron fittings now visible in warm light, the whole eastern wing glowing in a way it apparently had not done in a very long time. The staff member said nothing. Her expression was the same one Sarah had seen on the head of household, not surprise, something older than surprise. The wards, Sarah said carefully. How long have they been inactive? The staff member met her eyes for one moment, then looked forward. I'll show you to your room. The sealed door was at the far end of the east wing. She found it that evening walking the corridor alone, which Kael had not discouraged and had not accompanied. He gave her space the way he gave her silence, completely without apparent effort, as though he had decided something and was simply waiting for it to unfold. The door was set slightly apart from the others, framed in stone carved with markings she didn't recognize. It was sealed not with a lock, but with something older, a ward of closure. The seam of it faintly visible where the door met the frame, dark and cold and long held. She didn't touch it. She stood in front of it and it trembled. Not the building, not the floor, the door itself, a faint, almost inaudible vibration in the wood and stone, like something resonating to a frequency it had been waiting to hear. Sarah stood completely still and felt her wolf rise in her chest, pressing forward with that new intensity, that wide-awake hunger for something she couldn't yet name. She stepped back, she turned. Kael was standing at the far end of the corridor. She didn't know how long he'd been there. He was leaning against the opposite wall with his arms loosely crossed, watching her with an expression that was patient and careful and sealed as tightly as that door. And beneath all of it, in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands, something that looked like a man holding a very old grief very quietly in place. What is behind that door? She asked. History. He said, whose... The pause lasted exactly long enough to be an answer of its own. Rest, he said instead. We'll talk tomorrow. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the door, still now quiet, as though it too had decided to wait. She walked back to her room. She did not sleep for a long time, and in the darkness her wolf stayed awake beside her patient and certain and pointing like a compass toward something Sarah couldn't yet see. Chapter 5. Sarah had always been a better investigator than anyone gave her credit for. That was the thing about being underestimated consistently structurally by people who saw her bloodline before they saw her mind. It made her invisible in useful ways. People did not guard their words carefully around women they considered decorative. They did not lock their records rooms against someone they had categorized as peripheral. 6 years in, Ironvale had taught her exactly how much could be learned by a person the room had already dismissed. She started with the library. Draesonvale's archive occupied the entire lower level of the North Tower floor to ceiling old wood shelving. The smell of documents that had been accumulating longer than anyone currently living could remember. It was organized with the obsessive precision of a lineage that took its own history seriously. Census records, treaty documents, blood registry scrolls going back 4 centuries, pact alliance agreements filed by decade, cross-referenced by house. Sarah was methodical. She did not know what she was looking for, which meant she had to look for everything. She began with the Avara records. The House of Avara was older than most contemporary pacts cared to trace. Their alliance history was extensive and strategic, every union carefully chosen to consolidate influence rather than territory. Reading their treaty record was like watching a dynasty play a very long game across generations. The Ironvale entries appeared twice. A minor trade agreement 30 years ago, then 22 years ago something different. AA, filed not under alliance but under protection covenant. Sealed. The filing notation read only terms classified by mutual consent of both houses and the Lycan neutral court. Sarah sat with that for a moment. Classified by mutual consent meant both parties had agreed to seal the record, which meant both parties had something to hide. She cross-referenced the date 22 years ago with the Ironvale Pack census she had pulled from the adjacent shelf. Standard census filed annually. She ran her finger down the column of registered pack members for that year, then the year after. One entry had been removed, not redacted, removed. The physical paper had been cut surgically and precisely, leaving only the faint ghost of a line where something had been excised from the record. Someone had been erased. Sarah noted the page number, the approximate position of the removed entry, and the date range, and felt the particular cold clarity of a person who has just found not an answer but a shape. The outline of a secret. something that had been present and was now deliberately absent. She closed the census, opened the Lycan neutral court records for the same year, and there, in dry legal language filed under extraordinary protections and placements, one minor of unspecified lineage female placed with consenting family unit within Ironvale Pack territory under terms of the Avara Ironvale Covenant. Identity sealed by order of both houses. Duration indefinite pending dissolution of protective curse. Filed under the authority of the Lycan neutral court arbitration. Year 214. Sarah read it 3 times. A child traded placed within Ironvale Pack territory 22 years ago. Her identity sealed protected by a curse. She set the document down very carefully. She had been brought to Ironvale as an infant, her parents dead before she had memories. She had always been told it was tragedy, a border family lost to a rogue attack, a pack that had taken in a human-blooded orphan out of obligation. She had never had reason to question the shape of that story. She had reason now. She sat in the archive for a long time, not moving, while the implications arranged themselves around her in slow, terrible order. She was still sitting there when she heard the carriages arrive in the outer courtyard. She heard his voice before she saw him. Darian's voice carried the way it always had, that cultivated resonance designed to fill rooms to project authority into whatever space he entered. She heard it through the archive's high, narrow window, and her body responded before her mind could override it. A full system tightening. 6 years of conditioning responding to a familiar sound. She closed the documents, returned them precisely to their places, smoothed her expression into the composure she had spent the morning before the severance rite perfecting. Then she went to meet them. The reception hall was already occupied when she entered. Kael stood near the far window in conversation with 2 of his senior court members. The Avara delegation was arranged near the entrance, Lady Neva, her 2 senior attendants, and Darian, who was speaking with a Draesonvale official in the practiced, expansive way he spoke when he was performing confidence rather than feeling it. Sarah walked into the room. Darian saw her. She watched it happen. Watched the exact moment his eyes found her in the doorway and processed what they were seeing. She had expected anger. She had prepared herself for the particular cold fury of a man confronted with evidence that the thing he discarded had landed somewhere better than he intended. What she saw instead was fear, not performed concern, not political alarm, fear clean, instinctive, and immediately suppressed. But not before she saw it. Gone in a second, replaced by the smooth, neutral expression of a man who had spent his life managing his own reactions. But it had been there. She filed it, did not touch it yet. Then she looked at Neva. Lady Neva of Avara had not moved. She stood slightly apart from her attendants, watching Sarah with an expression that was impossible to read quickly, layered in a way that took a moment to parse. Guilt was in it somewhere half buried beneath control, and beneath the guilt something colder and more deliberate. Calculation, yes. But calculation aimed at what Sarah couldn't yet determine. She didn't have time to determine it. Kael had crossed the room. He moved without hurry, without announcement, simply redirected from his previous conversation to her side in a way that looked entirely natural and was, she suspected, entirely intentional. He stopped beside her, closer than courtesy required, and when he spoke, his voice was pitched for her alone. "You found something?" It wasn't a question. Several somethings, she said quietly. "I know." He kept his gaze forward toward the room. "Do not let them see you searching." A pause, brief, and waited. "Let them think you have already found." She absorbed that, turned it over. It was good advice. It was also the advice of a man who understood exactly what she was searching for and had chosen again not to simply tell her. She filed that, too. She looked out at the room at Darian, who had recovered his composure and was watching her with careful eyes, and Neva, who had not looked away once, and she arranged her expression into something she had learned in 6 years of Ironvale politics. Certainty. Quiet, unassailable certainty. Let them believe the game was already over. Let them spend the summit trying to figure out what she knew. She was still finding out herself, but they didn't need to know that. Not yet. Chapter 5. Sarah had always been a better investigator than anyone gave her credit for. That was the thing about being underestimated consistently, structurally, by people who saw her bloodline before they saw her mind. It made her invisible in useful ways. People did not guard their words carefully around women they considered decorative. They did not lock their records rooms against someone they had categorized as peripheral. 6 years in Ironvale had taught her exactly how much could be learned by a person the room had already dismissed. She started with the library. Draesonvale's archive occupied the entire lower level of the North Tower, floor-to-ceiling, old wood shelving, the smell of documents that had been accumulating longer than anyone currently living could remember. It was organized with the obsessive precision of a lineage that took its own history seriously. Census records, treaty documents, blood registry scrolls going back 4 centuries, pack alliance agreements filed by decade, cross-referenced by house. Sarah was methodical. She did not know what she was looking for, which meant she had to look for everything. She began with the Avara records. The House of Avara was older than most contemporary packs cared to trace. Their alliance history was extensive and strategic, every union carefully chosen to consolidate influence rather than territory. Reading their treaty record was like watching a dynasty play a very long game across generations. The Ironvale entries appeared twice. A minor treaty agreement 30 years ago, then 22 years ago, something different. A document filed not under alliance but under protection covenant. Sealed. The filing notation read only terms classified by mutual consent of both houses and the Lycan neutral court. Sarah sat with that for a moment. Classified by mutual consent meant both parties had agreed to seal the record, which meant both parties had something to hide. She cross-referenced the date 22 years ago with the Ironvale Pack census she had pulled from the adjacent shelf, standard census filed annually. She ran her finger down the column of registered pack members for that year, then the year after. One entry had been removed, not redacted, removed. The physical paper had been cut surgically and precisely leaving only the faint ghost of a line where something had been excised from the record. Someone had been erased. Sarah noted the page number, the approximate position of the removed entry, and the date range, and felt the particular cold clarity of a person who has just found not an answer but a shape. The outline of a secret. Something that had been present and was now deliberately absent. She closed the census, opened the Lycan neutral court records for the same year. And there, in dry legal language filed under extraordinary protections and placements, one minor of unspecified lineage female, placed with consenting family unit within Ironvale Pack territory under terms of the Avara Ironvale Covenant. Identity sealed by order of both houses. Duration indefinite pending dissolution of protective curse. Filed under the authority of the Lycan neutral court arbitration year 214. Sarah read it 3 times. A child traded placed within Ironvale Pack territory 22 years ago. Her identity sealed, protected by a curse. She set the document down very carefully. She had been brought to Ironvale as an infant, her parents dead before she had memories. She had always been told it was tragedy, a border family lost to a rogue attack, a pack that had taken in a human-blooded orphan out of obligation. She had never had reason to question the shape of that story. She had reason now. She sat in the archive for a long time, not moving, while the implications arranged themselves around her in slow, terrible order. She was still sitting there when she heard the carriages arrive in the outer courtyard. She heard his voice before she saw him. Darian's voice carried the way it always had, that cultivated resonance designed to fill rooms, to project authority into whatever space he entered. She heard it through the archive's high, narrow window, and her body responded before her mind could override it. A full system tightening. 6 years of conditioning responding to a familiar sound. She closed the documents, returned them precisely to their places, smoothed her expression into the composure she had spent the morning before the severance rite perfecting. Then she went to meet them. The reception hall was already occupied when she entered. Kael stood near the far window in conversation with 2 of his senior court members. The Avara delegation was arranged near the entrance. Lady Neva, her 2 senior attendants, and Darian, who was speaking with a Draesonvale official in the expansive way he spoke when he was performing confidence rather than feeling it. Sarah walked into the room. Darian saw her. She watched it happen, watched the exact moment his eyes found her in the doorway, and processed what they were seeing. She had expected anger. She had prepared herself for the particular cold fury of a man confronted with evidence that the thing he discarded had landed somewhere better than he intended. What she saw instead was fear. Not performed concern, not political alarm, fear clean, instinctive, and immediately suppressed. But not before she saw it. Gone in a second, replaced by the smooth, neutral expression of a man who had spent his life managing his own reactions. But it had been there. She filed, it did not touch it yet. Then she looked at Neva. Lady Neva of Avara had not moved. She stood slightly apart from her attendants, watching Sarah with an expression that was impossible to read quickly, layered in a way that took a moment to parse. Guilt was in it somewhere half buried beneath control, and beneath the guilt something colder and more deliberate. Calculation. Yes, but calculation aimed at what Sarah couldn't yet determine. She didn't have time to determine it. Kael had crossed the room. He moved without hurry, without announcement, simply redirected from his previous conversation to her side in a way that looked entirely natural, she suspected entirely intentional. He stopped beside her closer than courtesy required, and when he spoke, his voice was pitched for her alone. "You found something. It wasn't a question." "Several somethings," she said quietly. "I know." He kept his gaze forward toward the room. "Do not let them see you searching." A pause, brief and weighted. "Let them think you have already found." She absorbed that, turned it over. It was good advice. It was also the advice of a man who understood exactly what she was searching for and had chosen again not to simply tell her. She filed that too. She looked out at the room at Darian, who had recovered his composure and was watching her with careful eyes, and Neva, who had not looked away once, and she arranged her expression into something she had learned in 6 years of Ironvale politics. Certainty, quiet, unassailable certainty. Let them believe the game was already over. Let them spend the summit trying to figure out what she knew. She was still finding out herself, but they didn't need to know that. Not yet. Chapter 6. The ritual census was announced at breakfast, a formality the court herald explained standard procedure at any summit convened under Lycan neutral court authority. Every individual present guest or resident would submit to the bloodline verification before the day's formal proceedings began. The results would be recorded, witnessed, and filed with the neutral court for the summit record. Sarah listened to the announcement and felt nothing in particular about it. She had submitted to Pack census verification before it was routine in Ironvale conducted annually. A small cut to the palm, a drop of blood to the ritual flame. The flame read the blood's resonance and produced a color corresponding to lineage classification. Pure bloodlines burned deep crimson. Mixed heritage produced variations of amber and copper. Human-touched bloodlines burned a pale, steady orange. She had burned orange her entire life. She knew what her blood was. She took her place in the line of court members forming in the Great Hall between a senior Draesonvale advisor and one of Neva's attendants and waited. The elder conducting the census was ancient in the way of people who had stopped counting years because the number had ceased to be useful. He moved through the line with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times, carrying a shallow iron bowl in which a small flame burned with no visible fuel source, a Lycan working flame. Self-sustaining, calibrated to read blood resonance with the precision of centuries of refinement. Sarah watched him work his way down the line. Darian produced crimson, deep saturated with the blue undertone that marked the Voss bloodline's pure blood claim. He noted his own result with visible satisfaction before moving aside. Neva's blood burned a true crimson so dark it was nearly black, the concentrated result of a lineage that had been deliberately, systematically kept pure across generations. Even the elder paused over it, noting something in his ledger with the care of someone recording something exceptional. Then he reached Sarah. She extended her palm. The small blade was cold. The cut was shallow, practiced. She let 3 drops fall into the flame. The flame went out. For one suspended second, nothing. Just the absence of light where the flame had been a curl of smoke, the collective held breath of everyone watching. Then it returned. Not orange, not amber, not any color Sarah had produced in 23 years of Pack census verifications. Gold and silver burning together, intertwined, inseparable. The gold warm as noon and the silver cool as moonlight, twisting around each other in the shallow iron bowl in a way that looked less like fire and more like something alive. It didn't flicker, it burned steady and certain and impossibly bright for something so small. The hall had gone perfectly still. Sarah stared at it. The elder's hand, she noticed at the edge of her vision, had stopped moving above the ledger. She turned to look at him and found his face drained of color in a way that was not gradual. He had simply gone pale all at once, like something had pulled the blood from his skin. His eyes moved from the flame to Sarah's face and back to the flame, and in them was not confusion, but the stunned expression of a man who has encountered something he was told no longer existed. He recovered quickly professionally. He reached out and closed the ledger before the scribe beside him could record the result, a motion so smooth it might have looked routine to anyone not specifically watching for it. Then he looked at the hall, at the gathered court members and summit guests, some leaning forward, some exchanging glances, most trying to determine whether they had seen what they thought they had seen, and said in an even voice, "Technical irregularity. This registration will be completed privately." He collected the flame bowl, he collected the ledger, he walked away without meeting anyone's eyes. Sarah looked at Kael. She found him immediately. He was standing at the side of the hall where he had been positioned throughout the census, and he was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It lasted only a moment, a fracture in the composure he wore as constantly and naturally as his own skin, and through that fracture briefly, completely, she saw it all at once. Grief, guilt, and something else beneath both of them, something careful and old and aching that she had no name for yet, but that looked, if she was honest, like a man seeing something return to him that he had long since stopped believing he would see again. Then it closed. He looked away. The composure returned seamlessly. He moved to speak with a court advisor as though nothing had occurred, but she had seen it. She kept that and said nothing and spent the rest of the day walking through the summit's formal proceedings with a face that revealed nothing and a mind that was running very fast beneath it. She went to the East Wing that night. She hadn't planned to. She had returned to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and tried to think clearly about gold and silver flame and sealed documents and a child removed from a census record, and after an hour of that, she found herself standing in the East Corridor again without fully remembering the decision to come. The door trembled when she approached as it had before. This time she touched it. The ward of closure resisted. She felt it, a pressure against her palm, old and firmly set, but beneath the resistance something else. A recognition subtle and immediate like a lock encountering the correct key and beginning against long habit to consider opening. She pressed her palm flat against the wood. The ward didn't break, but a section of the wall beside the door paneling she had taken for structural unremarkable shifted. Just slightly. Just enough to reveal the edge of something behind it. She worked it carefully, the old panel moving on hinges that had not been used in years until she could see what was behind it. A painting hidden perhaps deliberately, perhaps simply lost to decades of sealed doors and avoided corridors. The woman in the portrait had Sarah's jaw, Sarah's eyes, dark, steady set at exactly that angle. She was younger in the portrait than Sarah was now. And she wore Lycan royal robes of deep midnight blue. And she held in her arms a wrapped infant with a thatch of dark hair and a face too new to read. The woman was not smiling in the way of people who perform happiness for portraits. She was smiling in the private, overwhelmed way of people who are feeling something too large for expression. Beneath the portrait, on a small plate of tarnished silver, Serafine Draeson, first daughter taken. Sarah stood in front of it for a very long time. Outside, the night was quiet. The corridor was lit warm gold and silver, the sconces burning steady, and the door beside her trembled faintly as though something on the other side had been waiting a very long time to be found. She pressed her hand against the wood one more time gently. I know, she thought, though she wasn't certain what she knew yet, only that everything she had believed about herself was built on a foundation someone had very deliberately laid. And that foundation was not what she had been told. Chapter 7, he was waiting for her in the map room, not her room, not the Great Hall, not any of the formal spaces the summit had colonized with politics and performance. The map room was small, tucked behind the library on the north side of the palace, a working room, its walls covered in territorial charts and old survey documents. A single long table at its center scarred by decades of use. 2 chairs. A fire that had been burning long enough to have settled into steady, reliable warmth. Kael was standing at the window when she entered, his back to the door, looking out at the dark courtyard below. He didn't turn immediately. He let her cross the room, let her take in the space, let her choose where to stand, and she chose the far end of the table where she could see both him and the door. Because 6 years in Ironvale had made certain spatial habits permanent. You saw the portrait, he said, still not turning. Yes. And the flame? Yes. He turned then. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the hall, but without the fracture this time, without the grief surfacing and retreating. He had made a decision between then and now. She could see it in the set of him. He had decided to stop managing what she was allowed to see. Sit down, he said quietly. Please. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, then seemed to reconsider and sat across from her. The fire moved between them, and the room was very still. I need you to let me finish before you speak, not because I'm asking for mercy, because what I have to tell you has a shape, and if I stop in the middle of it, I'm not certain I'll find my way back to the rest. She looked at him steadily, then tell it. He told it. 23 years ago, the Draesonvale line was in crisis. Not a political crisis, something older and more dangerous. A bloodline challenge from within the Lycan Court itself. A rival faction claiming the throne had been held through illegitimate succession, demanding verification of the royal line's purity and right to rule. The challenge had teeth. There were documents forged or otherwise, and there were council members willing to believe them. And there was genuine uncertainty about how the challenge would resolve. The Lycan King, Kael's father, had 2 children. Kael, 12 years old, already being prepared for succession, and a daughter 8 months old, whose existence was known only to the innermost circle of the royal household. The rival faction's strategy, if they seized the throne, would not be merciful to royal blood children included. My father made a bargain, Kael said. His voice was even careful, the voice of someone recounting something they have gone over enough times that the raw edge has been worn down to something manageable. The Ironvale bloodline. The Alpha at the time, Darian's grandfather, had ties to the Lycan neutral court, influence that could slow the challenge by time, introduce procedural obstacles while my father stabilized the political situation. He was willing to use that influence, but he required something in return. A child, Sarah said. A guarantee, Kael said. Something that would bind both families to the secrecy of the arrangement indefinitely, something neither side could expose without destroying themselves. He paused. My father agreed to place my sister within the Ironvale bloodline's territory, hidden, unregistered, her Lycan nature suppressed by a curse designed by the neutral court's own practitioners. She would live as a human-touched she-wolf, she would be unknown, untraceable, and she would remain that way until the curse was dissolved. How was it dissolved? A true severance. A willing bond, freely given, not arranged, not political, broken by rejection. His jaw shifted. The curse was designed around the theory that only genuine emotional choice could constitute the trigger, something that couldn't be manufactured or coerced, a real bond voluntarily made and then genuinely destroyed by the other party. He looked at her directly. Darian's public rejection wasn't simply cruelty, it was precise. Whether he knew it or not, and I believe he did not, the form of it, the willingness of the bond, the public and total nature of the severance, it met every condition. The fire moved. Sarah sat with what he had just said and felt it move through her in layers, the way deep cold moved, not all at once, but progressively, each layer landing separately. The wolf that had woken in the rain. The wards that lit when she walked beneath them. The flame in the census bowl burning gold and silver. The portrait of a woman with her own face and a name beneath it that was not quite hers and yet entirely hers. Serafine Draeson, first daughter taken. She was 8 months old, Sarah said. Yes, you were 12. Something crossed his face. Yes, you watched them take her. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. She didn't need him to confirm it. She sat with all of it, the shape of it, the full weight of it, and did not speak for a long time. The fire burned. The room held still around them. Kael waited, and she understood now why his patience was so absolute. He had been waiting for this conversation for 23 years. He knew how to wait. She was not the same person who had walked through Ironvale's gates 3 days ago. She could feel that plainly, factually, without drama. That woman had known who she was. This woman was sitting across from a king who had just told her she was his sister, that she was a princess, that the entire architecture of her identity had been constructed by other people's desperation and sustained by a curse that had dissolved in the rain outside a border town when a man she had once loved cast her out in front of an intinction audience. She thought about the Ironvale Pack, about 6 years of being useful but not worthy, about bleeding in border wars for a bloodline that had been paid to hide her. She thought about the road, the storm, a collapsed archway, and a man with stormlight eyes who had said yes without conditions. She looked at Kael. Did you know, she said carefully, when I proposed to you in the rain? The question landed in the room and stayed there. Kael looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, she watched him face something he could not manage or redirect or wait out. His expression didn't break this time. It simply became very still, in the way of a man standing at the exact edge of the truth he has been carrying and finding that the distance between holding it and releasing it is smaller than he prepared for. He did not answer immediately. That silence was its own kind of answer. And in it, Sarah understood several things at once, things she would spend the days that followed deciding what to do with. That he had been looking for her, that the storm and the archway and the border road had not been coincidence, that his yes in the rain had not been impulsive or merciful or strange, that he had known and said yes anyway, and let her believe it was her choice. She held that. It was a complicated thing to hold. Get out, she said quietly. Please, I need the room. He stood immediately, no argument, no explanation, no request for understanding. He crossed to the door and paused with his hand on the frame. I know, he said. That knowing doesn't make it smaller. Then he left. She sat alone in the map room with the fire and the weight of 23 years of someone else's secret. And for the first time since the gates of Ironvale had closed behind her, she let herself feel all of it. Every last piece. Chapter 8, she gave herself one night. One night in the map room with the fire and the truth and the full unmanaged weight of everything she now knew. She did not sleep. She did not perform composure for anyone. She sat with the grief and the fury and the strange, disorienting vertigo of a woman discovering that the ground she had been standing on her entire life was someone else's architecture, and she let herself feel it completely because she had learned in 6 years of Ironvale what happened to feelings that were managed instead of faced. They became structural, they held weight, they were never meant to hold quietly until something collapsed. She felt it all. Then when the fire had burned low and the first gray light was beginning at the window, she stood up, straightened her clothes, and began to work. She sent the summons herself, not through Kael's court herald, not through any of the Draesonvale administrative channels that would have routed the request through layers of existing authority. She wrote 4 separate documents in her own hand, sealed them with the signet ring she had been carrying in her pocket since the morning she woke in the White House and found the crown engraved on its face. And she had a junior staff member she had spoken with twice and assessed as both competent and discreet deliver them before the summit's morning session convened. Kael received his in his private study, Darian received his in his guest quarters, Neva received hers at her breakfast table. The elder who had conducted the census, who had not Sarah noted, left Draesonvale as she might have expected but had instead remained in quiet residence in the North Wing, received his in the archive where she suspected he had spent the night reviewing records she had pulled 2 days ago. The summons said the same thing to all 4 of them. The East Council Chamber 1-hour attendance is not optional. She did not sign it with her given name. She signed it with the name on the portrait Serafine Draeson. They came. She was already seated when they arrived at the head of the council table. The documents arranged before her with the precision of someone who had spent the pre-dawn hours organizing them into an argument that could not be dismantled by interruption or political maneuvering. The blood records from the archive, the neutral court filing the census page with its surgically removed entry, a copy of the Avara Ironvale Protection Covenant she had transcribed from memory the night before. And at the center of the table, where everyone could see it, the portrait unframed, now the nameplate still attached. Serafine Draeson, first daughter taken. Kael took a seat to her left without being directed to it. He folded his hands on the table and said nothing. And his expression was the one she was coming to understand as his version of attention fully given, still present, and entirely without agenda. Darian sat across from her and looked at the portrait for a long moment. Then he looked at Sarah. The fear she had seen in the reception hall had not left his face. It had simply been compressed, managed, hidden beneath the political composure he had been trained since childhood to maintain. But it was there. She could see it clearly now, the way she could see clearly anything she had been specifically looking for long enough. Neva sat at the far end of the table and looked at no one. Her hands were in her lap. Her posture was immaculate. She had the expression of a woman who had been anticipating this room for a very long time. The elder sat quietly. He looked, if anything, relieved. "I'm not calling this meeting to celebrate," Sarah said. Her voice filled the chamber without effort, steady, unhurried, the voice of someone who had decided exactly what they were going to say and was not interested in being redirected from it. "I'm not calling it to be officially recognized or to be placed ceremonially into a position I didn't ask for. I'm calling it because there are agreements in this room that were made over my body about my life without my knowledge or consent, and I intend to address every single one of them before this summit closes." She opened the first document. She started with the Protection Covenant. She walked through its terms precisely what had been agreed, what each party had received, what each party had surrendered, and she did it without heat, without accusation, in the flat, informational tone of someone reading a record into evidence. She noted the Ironvale bloodline's compensation. She noted the neutral court's facilitation. She noted that no provision had been made for the child's knowledge of or consent to her own placement because in the legal framework of 23 years ago, an 8-month-old's future consent had not been considered a relevant variable. "It will be considered relevant now," she said. "I'm formally registering my objection to the original terms and opening renegotiation of every benefit the Ironvale bloodline received under this covenant." Darian's jaw tightened. "You have no legal standing to I have the blood record," she said simply. "I have the neutral court filing. I have a census document from which my entry was deliberately removed, which is, I believe, a falsification offense under Lycan neutral court statute." She paused. "Your grandfather's offense, not yours. I'm noting the distinction. But the benefits your bloodline accrued from that covenant, including the political capital that funded your father's alpha claim and subsequently your own, those are directly relevant to your current alpha prime bid." She watched him understand what she was saying. The alpha prime bid required a clean record of legitimate succession. If the political capital underpinning 2 generations of the Voss line's rise could be traced to a covenant now under formal challenge, the challenge would reach the succession record. The neutral court would freeze the bid pending review. Darian was very still. The Avara alliance. Sarah continued, turning to Neva, was structured to seal this covenant and prevent exactly this conversation from happening. Lady Neva, she said the name without cruelty, without edge. Your house has carried this secret for 23 years. I'm not asking for an accounting of that today. I am noting formally that the political foundation of the alliance is now part of an open neutral court challenge and that any agreements predicated on its continuation are suspended pending resolution. Neva looked at her for the first time since sitting down. Her expression was still that layered, impossible-to-read thing, guilt and calculation and something beneath both. But she nodded. One short, unambiguous acknowledgement. Kael had not moved. Sarah could feel him watching her the way she could feel the warmth from the fire on her left, steadily, from a fixed point with a quality of attention that didn't waver or shift. She did not look at him. Not yet. She worked through the rest of the documents methodically. The census falsification, the ward suppression records she had found in the archive's lower shelves the night before detailing the curse's construction, the confirmation in the elder's own filed notes from the night of the blood census that the gold-silver flame result had been recorded and then sealed, a secondary falsification she had not anticipated finding, and which added considerably to the evidentiary weight of what sat before them. When she had finished, the room was quiet in a specific way, the quiet of people who have run out of positions to retreat to and are waiting to see what comes next. It was Kael who raised the final issue. Not because she couldn't, because he raised it first and she had not expected him to. And the fact that he did told her something she filed away carefully, the binding, he said. His voice was neutral, carrying none of the weight the word deserved. Made between the Lycan King and the Lycan Princess. Royal law prohibits binding contracts between direct bloodline members, the original intent being inheritance disputes, but the letter of the law is broader, it requires formal dissolution. The elder confirmed quietly. The binding would need to be annulled. Both parties would need to appear before the neutral court within 30 days of the issue being raised. 30 days, the room waited. Sarah looked at the documents on the table. She looked at the portrait, her mother's face, and her own face, and the infant she had been caught in a moment before everything was decided for her. She looked at Kael. He was looking back at her. That same steady, unmanaged attention, no performance, no direction, no waiting out, just present. Neither of them spoke. The 30 days began. Neither of them moved toward the door. Chapter 9. She should have anticipated it. In fairness to herself, she had considered in the pre-dawn hours after the council meeting that Darian would not accept the suspension of his Alpha Prime bid without attempting one final maneuver. She knew him had spent 6 years studying the architecture of how he moved when cornered. He did not concede, he did not retreat, he redirected, reframed, and attacked from an angle that forced his opponent onto unfamiliar ground. What she had underestimated was his timing. He moved on the third day of the summit's formal proceedings. The open session convened in the Great Hall at full attendance. Every court member, every summit delegate, every elder warrior representative, and diplomatic observer who had come to Draesonvale under the banner of Lycan Neutral Court authority. The largest possible audience assembled in the largest possible room, she had to admit, in the cold, analytical part of her mind that assessed such things regardless of personal stakes, that it was well chosen. He rose during the open address period, the summit's designated time for formal challenges and declarations, and he did it correctly, procedurally, with the precision of a man who had prepared his language carefully and knew the exact legal framework within which he was operating. I invoke the right of formal challenge, he said, under Article 9 of the Lycan Neutral Court Summit Protocols. A challenge to the legitimacy of evidence presented in closed council and to the standing of an individual whose claim to identity within this court remains in my assessment unverified and politically motivated. The hall's ambient noise dropped to nothing in the way of a room that has been waiting for something and recognizes its arrival. Kael, seated at the head of the assembly, said nothing. His expression was the one Sarah had come to know as its own form of response, absolute stillness that was not passivity. The stillness of a man who has decided to let something play out to its end. Sarah was seated 3 positions to Kael's right in the place that had been assigned to her since the morning after the council chamber meeting, when the court's senior members had quietly and without announcement begun adjusting the seating arrangements to reflect a reality they had not yet formally confirmed but were treating as settled. She felt the hall's attention move to her like a physical thing. She looked at Darian and waited. He turned to address the room rather than her. Another well-chosen tactical decision, framing her as a subject of the address rather than its recipient, diminishing her standing through the grammar of how he positioned himself. The individual presented to this court as Serafine Draeson, He said, arrived at Draesonvale 3 days ago as a woman I formally and legally severed bond with under Ironvale Pack law. Within 48 hours of that arrival, blood records were produced, a portrait was located, and a census document was presented, all of which have been in Draesonvale's archive under Draesonvale's control for the entirety of their existence. He paused, letting that land. I am not suggesting incompetence. I am raising the question of whether evidence held exclusively by one party produced conveniently at the moment that party requires it constitutes verification or construction. He let the silence do the work he had designed it to do. I am further raising the question, he continued, of whether a woman who proposed marriage to the Lycan King within hours of her severance, a woman with known political acumen and 6 years of experience in pack governance, might have seen an opportunity and pursued it with the same discipline she applied to every other advantage she cultivated inside my pack. The hall was very still. Sarah looked at Darian for a moment. She looked at the room, at the faces turning between them, at the careful diplomatic neutrality of the neutral court observers, at the Draesonvale court members whose expressions ranged from controlled anger to professional blankness. She looked at Kael. He was watching her, not the room, not Darian, her. And his expression said with perfect clarity and without a word, "This is yours. I will not take it from you." She stood up. She had not planned to shift. That was the truth of it, and it mattered because everything that happened next was not performance, not strategy, not the calculated deployment of something she had been holding in reserve. It was simply the moment her body made a decision her mind had not yet reached. She stepped away from the table into the open space at the center of the hall, and she let go. The shift when it came was nothing like the shifts she had known before, the labored, half-finished transitions of a suppressed nature working against its own constraints. This was immediate and total and entirely without pain, like a door opened from both sides simultaneously. The gold came first, warm, flooding the color of the census flame spreading from her center outward. Then the silver threading through it, cool and precise and certain. The two colors inseparable and unmistakable to anyone who had seen the flame 3 days ago in this same hall. She was large. She had not known she would be large. Lycan royal forms were historically substantial, the old text said, but knowing and understanding were different things. She stood in the center of the great hall, and the space accommodated her, and she did not growl, did not advance, did not do anything that could be framed as threat or aggression. She simply stood gold and silver, just like the flame present, and undeniable and entirely without apology. The silence in the hall was absolute. It held for a long moment that suspended collective stillness of a room processing something that has moved beyond argument into evidence. Then from the back of the hall, a sound fabric shifting a body, lowering. One elder, white-haired and precise, dropping to one knee. The movement spread not in a wave, not theatrical, not coordinated. One by one, unhurried and individual, each person making their own decision, reaching their own moment of recognition. Another elder, 2 court members, the head of household, who had whispered, "The lost daughter returns 3 days ago," and had been waiting since to say it properly, the warriors along the far wall, one after another, with the straightforward practicality of people who have assessed something and reached a conclusion. Darian stood alone. He did not kneel. She had not expected him to, and she did not want him to. The gesture would have cost him something she had no interest in extracting. She watched him stand in the thinning circle of his own position and felt something she had not anticipated, not satisfaction, not triumph, something quieter, something that was almost pity and then wasn't, and then settled into the simple acknowledgement of a chapter ending. He looked at her, really looked, the performance finally gone, and beneath it, he was just a man who had made choices that had brought him here. And then he looked away. The shift back was as easy as the first had been. She stood in the center of the hall in her own skin and breathed. Neva moved without announcement. She simply stood, walked the length of the hall with the measured composure of someone who has made a decision they have been circling for a very long time, and came to stand beside Sarah, not behind her, beside her. The positioning deliberate, its meaning legible to everyone watching. She did not address the room, she did not perform. She turned to Sarah and leaned close and spoke quietly enough that the hall could not hear. Sarah listened. Her expression did not change. She had enough control for that even now. But something moved through her eyes briefly that those close enough to see would spend a long time trying to name. She looked at Neva for a moment after the words ended, then she nodded once, small and private and entirely real. The hall watched and did not hear, and that silence, the not hearing of it, the sense of something significant passing between 2 women at the front of a room full of witnesses, was somehow more powerful than anything that had been said aloud. Chapter 10. The summit ended without ceremony. That was her preference, and Kael had honored it. No formal closing address, no celebratory gathering, no structured moment designed to underline what had occurred in the Great Hall and make it legible for posterity. The delegates departed over 3 days quietly and in their own time, and the Draesonvale staff returned the palace to its ordinary rhythms with the practiced efficiency of people who had served through enough history to know that the most significant moments rarely required decoration. Darian left on the second day not under guard. That had been her decision, and it had surprised people, and she had not explained it beyond the formal statement she filed with the neutral court that she was separating the question of the original covenant's harms from the question of Darian's personal culpability, and that the council judgment she was requesting addressed the falsification of pack records, the deliberate perpetuation of a sealed agreement for political benefit, and the misuse of succession capital derived from that agreement. Not execution, not exile accountability, the specific unglamorous procedural kind that required him to sit before a council and answer questions and have his answers recorded and his decisions reviewed and his Alpha Prime bid suspended indefinitely pending resolution. The kind of justice that didn't make a good story but was, in her assessment, the kind that actually held. She had watched him walk through the gates from the east corridor window, and she had felt the last of something release in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever in any complete sense, but the particular weight of 6 years carrying someone else's version of her worth that she let go of. It left a space she was only beginning to understand the shape of. The east wing door was open now. The ward of closure had dissolved the morning after the hall gradually, as though it had been waiting for confirmation of something, and then simply let go the sealed seams separating cleanly, the door swinging inward without resistance. What was inside was what she had expected, and also nothing she could have prepared for. A room preserved with the specific heartbreaking care of people who had maintained hope long past the point where hope was rational. Her mother's belongings books, a small wooden box containing correspondence in handwriting Sarah did not recognize and spent 3 days reading. An infant's blanket white, folded with precision, kept long after there was any practical reason to keep it. She had spent time in the room every day since it opened, not in grief exactly, in something more like introduction, meeting a woman she would never know through the evidence she had left behind, building a picture from fragments that would always have gaps. It was incomplete, and it was permanent, and she was learning to hold both of those things simultaneously. The portrait had been rehung on the east corridor wall where the sconces burned gold and silver every time Sarah walked beneath them. She had stopped noticing it as strange. It had begun to feel like what it was, a house recognizing its own. Kael found her in the east wing on a quiet morning 3 weeks after the summit had closed. She was sitting in the window seat at the corridor's end, the one that looked out over the valley where Draesonvale sat in its permanent, unhurried way. The autumn light coming in at a low angle that turned everything amber and specific. She heard him coming, she always heard him now, had learned the particular cadence of his footsteps unhurried and even, and she didn't turn immediately. He settled into the chair across from her, the ease of someone who had decided to some time ago that waiting was not the same as losing. They sat in the quiet for a while. It was a comfortable quiet that was still new enough that she noticed it. "You never told me," he said eventually. What Neva whispered. She had been waiting for him to ask. She had been carrying it for 3 weeks, not as a secret, not as a withheld thing, but as something that needed the right moment, needed the east wing and the amber light and the portrait visible at the end of the corridor. She looked at him. She said, "Our mother chose my name before I was placed." Her voice was steady and quiet. She said she asked Neva's family to remember it in case. She paused. She said it meant in the old language she who returns. The corridor was very still. Kael looked at her for a long moment. She watched him receive it, watched something move through him that he didn't manage or redirect, that he simply allowed to pass through his expression the way weather passed through open country. His jaw shifted. His eyes were bright in the way of someone holding something back, not out of suppression, but out of the sheer effort of containing a feeling too large for the available space. "She knew," Sarah said softly. "She named me for the hope of it." "Yes," he said. His voice was very low. She was right. He looked at her for another long moment, then quietly, "Yes, she was." The proposal to review the royal binding had been filed with the neutral court a week after the summit. Sarah had drafted it herself, as she had drafted most things in the weeks since, with the methodical precision of someone who had found to her own mild surprise that governance was not so different from the work she had been doing invisibly in Ironvale for years. The only difference was that now her name was on it. The proposal was simple in principle and complex in application that any bond made freely and in good faith, regardless of the legal complications subsequently discovered, could be reviewed not for annulment but for voluntary confirmation that a bond entered in ignorance of identity could be honored by choice. It was. The senior neutral court advisor had told her with careful, diplomatic neutrality unprecedented. She had told him she was aware of that. It was working its way through the court's review process with the unhurried pace of legal bodies that had been operating for centuries and saw no reason to accelerate for individuals. In the meantime, the binding existed in a state of procedural suspension, neither confirmed nor dissolved, and neither she nor Kael had mentioned the 30-day dissolution window since the council chamber meeting. The 30 days had passed. Neither of them had mentioned that either. He asked her on a morning that was not different from other mornings. No occasion, no framing, nothing that marked it as a moment being constructed for significance. He simply looked at her in the east wing window seat with the amber light between them and said, "Will you stay?" Not as a king asking a princess, not as a brother asking a sister. The roles were real, and she had made her peace with the shape of them, complicated, unprecedented, requiring new language that existing frameworks didn't quite provide. But that was not what he was asking. She looked at him. "Why did you say yes?" she asked in the rain. He had been ready for this question. She had known he would be ready, had known that he had been carrying his answer the way she had been carrying Neva's whispered words, waiting for the right chord or the right light. "Because," he said, "you were the only person who had ever asked me for something without knowing what I could give." She held that, turned it over, the way she turned over everything carefully, completely looking at it from each side. He had been the Lycan King since he was 19 years old. He had been negotiated with, petitioned, courted, deferred to, and feared. He had been given things in exchange for what people wanted from him since before he was old enough to understand the transaction. And then a woman in the rain, stripped of her name and furious and undisguised, had asked him for the one thing nobody with full information would have thought to ask, had asked him for a choice freely, with nothing to offer and nothing to gain and no knowledge of what he was. She understood. "I'll stay," she said. Not because she owed him, not because the binding required it, or politics suggested it, or the portrait at the end of the corridor meant she belonged here by blood. She stayed because she had made every significant decision in her adult life in service of someone else's future, and this was the first one she was making entirely for herself. She stayed because she chose to. Outside, the valley held Draesonvale in its ancient permanent way. The sconces in the east corridor burned gold and silver. The door at the wing's end stood open as it would stand from now on. And in the quiet of a morning that required no ceremony, the lost daughter who had always been, she who returns, came home. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if you felt Sarah's fury, her grief, her becoming, then you already know why we tell these stories, not for the crowns for the moment. Someone who is made to feel like nothing discovers exactly what they are. Subscribe for new stories every week and hit the notification bell so you never miss a chapter. Drop a comment below. When did you first suspect the truth about Sarah? I read every single one.